Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to objectively unpack a truly fascinating alternative framework. We are completely reimagining the ancient Grail Code. You see, the sources we're looking at today suggest that this code isn't just some set of moral rules or a social contract imposed on us from the outside. Not at all. Instead, they present it as the literal physics of consciousness, a behavioral manifestation of a very specific, transcendent form of biology. So let's dive right in with a massive paradigm-shifting question: what if true ethical behavior is actually dictated by the physics of sustainability and wave mechanics? Like, what if doing the right thing isn't about following a law, but about having the specific genetic and biological hardware that physically prevents you from doing otherwise? It's a wild thought, right?
Section 1. Physics of sacred shareability. Let's break down what this actually means in a biological context.
When you analyze the power spectra of capacitive fields, which literally measures life force electrically, you start to see what the sources call the biological test for pure intention. They argue that biological sustainability fundamentally requires a perfect symmetry of charge. Basically, according to the texts, for an organism, or even an emotion, to survive and propagate, it absolutely must be shareable. It has to fit perfectly into the environment's energetic wave structure without destroying it. This symmetry is the ultimate physical test for what is actually sustainable.
And this brings us to a radical redefinition. In this worldview, the word sacred completely loses its traditional religious baggage. It just becomes a physics term for absolute sustainability. When waves, energy, or even people can meet and share space completely non-destructively, well, that interaction is literally defined as sacred.
And it's fascinating how human biology achieves this. Take the heart's electricity, for example. It utilizes the golden mean ratio, or phi. The sources explain that when we feel certain positive emotions, the harmonics of our heartbeats space themselves out perfectly according to this exact ratio. This is what allows the electrical waves to nest and share space perfectly, creating this beautifully self-sustaining fractal structure.
So how does this physics translate into actual human emotion? Well, this is where it gets absolutely incredible. Compassion is defined mechanically as perfect compression. It's literally the biological skill of turning your heart's electrical field inside out. And by doing so, you create a perfect fractal image of someone else's feelings right inside your own field. You are literally making space for their outside reality within your inside reality.
Section 2. Biology of the Hive Mind. Let's see how this physics builds into a shared reality.
The texts actually point to that famous phrase spoken by Jesus, the law of God written on the hearts of men in tongues of fire, but they look at it through this wild lens of biophysics. They suggest he wasn't speaking metaphorically at all. He was describing genetic righteousness. It's an internal code that arises completely naturally from an attuned, genetically connected group of empathic individuals who are operating with a shared collective consciousness.
There's a really stark contrast at the center of this whole theory. On one side, you have the Grail Code. This is an internal constant, rooted deeply in specific brain chemistry, natural empathy, and emotional detachment. Then, on the other side, you have everyday external law. According to the sources, normal human laws only exist because people fear the consequences of breaking them. The Grail Code, though, it requires zero external enforcement. It's a biological imperative.
Moving on to Section 3, Ethics of the Grail Code. Building on that biological foundation, what happens when this physics actually governs? Within this esoteric framework, we encounter the Christos principle. Again, stripped of all traditional religious meaning, this is defined as the ultimate permission for waves and people to share space totally and non-destructively. When you have this level of perfect wave sharing and absolute empathy, it effectively destroys the ability and honestly entirely removes the need to keep secrets.
Think about how magnetic vector fields couple and phase lock together. In this theory, that's the literal metaphor for human interaction under the Grail Code. Any thought or feeling that is unshareable, meaning it lacks symmetry or harbors selfish intent, just cannot phase lock. It cannot propagate as a wave. Therefore, according to the physics of this theory, biology eventually purges those unshareable elements through death. Only the shareable is immortal.
Section 4. The Elven Holocaust. So, if this internal code is so perfect, why isn't it the standard today? Well, according to this alternative historical narrative, the ancient dragon bloodlines, who were the genetic carriers of the Grail Code, made a fatal tactical error. They applied the golden rule to non-empathic species. Because their transcendent consciousness operated in an environment of absolute truth and empathy, they naturally extended that same innate trust to ordinary humans. And those humans, the sources state, function primarily on animal survival instincts and personal greed. If we trace this chronologically, we see a really systematic exploitation. It all centers on the donation of Constantine. The texts report that this was a fraudulent document that surfaced in the 8th century, supposedly written way back in 337 AD. The Catholic Church allegedly used this forgery to usurp the rightful Merovingian kings, the true dragon descendants, in 751 AD, replacing them with easily controlled puppet rulers.
And the sources claim this usurpation triggered a 1,000-year genocide directed at the fairy or dragon bloodlines. The empathic overlords were overthrown and replaced by the Carolingians, who are described here as insensitive tyrants. Ultimately, this led to the complete abandonment of the Grail Code, replacing a naturally empathic society with a corrupted, stark form of feudal totalitarianism and rigid, fear-based control.
Section 5. Law of the Overlord. This historical tragedy really brings us to a harsh realization about how the code was originally meant to be applied.
The texts are incredibly impartial about this, reporting a very rigid division in how these ancient rulers operated. The profound empathy, the royal communism, and the hive mind of the Grail Code, that was strictly reserved for those of the Grail blood. It was entirely an in-group biological phenomenon. For outsiders, though, the code was completely different. It focused purely on maintaining strict order and control for the benefit of the overlords.
In fact, one of the sources points out that the ancient Sumerian deity Enlil was apparently right all along about this. Applying a code of absolute, defenseless empathy to a species driven by selfish survival instincts, it was a biological and tactical impossibility. It was this exact misapplication of empathy that directly led to the downfall of the dragon families. Section 6. Igniting the DNA song. Let's look at the historical attempts to salvage this lost biological harmony. The sources suggest certain historical figures, specifically noting Jesus as a member of this dragon lineage, actually attempted to restore this tradition of true biological governance. The aim was to reignite the song in the blood, that's the piezoelectric singing of DNA, literally the electrical vibration of our genetic code. This is perfectly represented by the metaphor of the golden mean spiral, demonstrating that perfect recursive fractal path that connects the individual right to the collective. By achieving this perfect fractal compression, that biological compassion we talked about earlier, the ultimate goal of the Grail Code is finally revealed. It is to allow human awareness to be distributed infinitely as a wave. In this framework, this perfect sharing of energetic space, that is exactly what makes consciousness truly sustainable and effectively immortal.
So I want to leave you with this really provocative thought to wrap up today's explainer. If, as these sources suggest, true sustainable empathy is entirely a matter of specific genetics and wave physics, where does that leave the rest of humanity in the quest for global peace? If it cannot just be taught as a moral rule, but actually must be inherited as a biological trait, how do we move forward? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating framework with me today.